today we're going to be continuing our class in regards to the pearls of the Prophet ﷺ and the beautiful, beautiful sessions in regards to knowing and living with the Prophet ﷺ is something that we could never whatsoever get bored of, because there's always a lot to say. There's always a lot to learn. There's always something that would be inspirational where we have to keep up with. And inshallah, today we're going to be continuing with that hadith that we had really covered some of the hadith yesterday. So let's just go over really quick what we were talking about. We were talking about those hadith, and yesterday or the day before yesterday, إن الله لا ينظر إلى أجسادكم ولا إلى صوركم ولكن ينظر إلى قلوبكم. That the Lord Almighty does not look at your appearances or your appearance, or even I guess the outside of you. That's not what matters. What really matters is ولكن ينظر إلى قلوبكم, but looks at the heart. Now, it's really important to mention when we're speaking about the heart, is this a metaphor? Is this an actual thing in where what you're really created? In other words, a piece of flesh, and etc. Now, you want to keep in mind that in the Quran and in the Sunnah, it uses the heart meaning the core, the person on the inside, as really the place where all the intention, all the reality of who you are and what you are is really downplayed within your heart, within really your core. And that's not necessarily to mean the actual heart gland with, of course, the different chambers in the gland and so forth, the one that pumps the blood. This is not necessarily talking about a particular gland, although some research is showing that there are different neurocells within the heart, and that the heart is doing a lot more function than what we used to think of the heart doing. But at the end of the day, in Lugha Arabiya, when we say il-qalb doesn't necessarily only mean the actual gland, but it can also mean the core. So even the brain is a core. Even when we're speaking about your own abdomen, that's a core. All those areas that are within you is the core. So what the Quran or the Hadith are suggesting, that what happens within your body, the intentions, or let's say the different areas that would contribute to making you who you are. Number one, it's yes, the brain. Two, the heart. Three, the soul. All of these would determine what actions are carried out. And at the end of the day, the appearance that you don't control, because the appearance is God-given. Although, yes, right now, with this aesthetic stuff, they are definitely changing a lot, but that still does not mean that that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would look at. It's not the appearance, it's basically on the inside, and this is to lay out metaphorically and, let's say, practically, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would look more for, one, your sincerity, and two, your khuluq. And we went in little details, and we said that for somebody, al-khalq is basically the way that something is created, and al-khalq is basically creation, and khalaqa, the actual verb, which is the root, it means created, and al-khuluq comes from the same root, which really is describing the internal description. So you're looking at Lugha Arabiya is extremely intricate and extremely detailed, and there are so many different webbings in how it stretches out to really let that etymology connect with one another in order to bring about that trace and what it eventually would conjugate into. So this is extremely important to know how each word traces back to a certain root and how this root is related to later on what it was conjugated into. So therefore, suggesting that when we're looking at وَلَكِ يَنْظُرُ إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ, but looks into your hearts to tell us that what really goes on within your heart, just as in another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had said, ألا وإن في الجسد لمضغة إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله. You could see that there's a direct correlation between what is mentioned in this hadith and another major hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had said that verily there is a piece of flesh within the body, a piece of flesh within the body, and if that rottens, then the rest of the body rottens. If it is going the right direction, in other words, functioning well, then the rest of the body is going to go within that direction of function, within that direction of giving, of course, the body the health that it needs. And that is basically described by the Prophet ﷺ literally that is al-qalb. Even though it's a small piece of flesh, but consider that qalb is basically what's going to determine everything. Well, we know that the whole thing about cardiovascular is not necessarily, yes, it's definitely a very dangerous organ, but this is not talking about the actual organ itself that we would know in medicine. But this is to tell us that your heart also plays a key role in determining what your position is. What your position is in terms of where you're going in dunya, in akhirah, etc. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the intention in Islam is even more important than the actual action, which really takes us into the second hadith that we did yesterday. إن بالمدينة لرجالا ما سرتم مسيرا ولا قطعتم واديا إلا كانوا معكم حبسهم المرض. The Prophet ﷺ had said that in Medina there are certain men, no matter what distance you would cross or pass, in whatever valleys you might go and probably go into, and they would always be considered as if they had been present with you, even though they weren't physically there. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that they would be considered there as if they were going through every challenge that you would be facing. And the reason why they would be considered as rewarded for something that they had not done was really because of the sincerity, the intention that if they were capable of joining along, they would have come. But it was beyond their ability, beyond their capacity. And in the story, or at least in this context, within this hadith, they were not capable to join along because they were facing illness. In other words, there was an illness that really imprisoned them in basically not allowed them to join the group and so forth. So in that situation, just keeping in mind that when we're speaking about deeds, sincerity is key, and even more important than the action itself, because you will be getting rewarded for an action that you might not have actually done, just because you had the sincerity that if you were capable of doing it, that you would have been part of this. And of course, we went to the second hadith with the Prophet ﷺ actually saying, إِنَّكَ لَن تُنْفِقَ نَفَقَةً تَبْتَغِيَ بِهَا وَجْهَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا أُجِرْتَ عَلَيْهَا حَتَّى ما تجعل في فم امرأتك. The Prophet ﷺ said every single nafaqa, everything that you would spend, and if it is for the sake of the Lord Almighty, for the sake of the face of the Lord Almighty, which is, of course, metaphorically for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you would get the reward for it. Now, here's one thing. When you're speaking about this in a comprehensive way, that you would get the reward for it, but what really and how small are we, or big are we really talking about in terms of really getting the reward for something? So that's where the Prophet ﷺ said, حتى ما تجعل في فم امرأتك. Even if it's a piece of food that you probably spoon-fed your wife with, or perhaps something that many would not recognize. There is another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had said that everything is a sadaqah, even imatatul adha an al-tariq sadaqah, even if you were to pick up some trash off the floor, that's a sadaqah. Even if you were to say la ilaha illallah, that in itself is a sadaqah. And that's of course seen within the hadith where the Sahaba, they went to the Prophet ﷺ. We talked about that before in the other hadith where they said, here we go, ذهب أهل الدثور بالأجور يصلون كما نصلي ويصومون كما نصوم ويتصدقون بفضول أموالهم. What was that in regards? That the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba, they came to him, and you want to keep in mind that the majority of the Sahaba were actually considered poor and not necessarily rich. But there were some very rich Sahaba. There were some Sahaba that even though they got poor moving out of Mecca, but they managed to know how to get into business really quick. And even though they lost their millions, but they knew how to go up, just like Abdurrahman ibn Auf. He just knew, I'll tell you the story. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he was considered a millionaire. In Mecca. But then when he migrated to Medina, it's a completely new place. Completely, I guess everything's played out differently because Mecca was dependent on business. Why? Because the terrain is not the best terrain. It's pretty much not a fertile land. It's pretty much not having any resources to grow. So it was really dependent on commerce, because there's nothing that earth can grow for them to make use of it. So whether you wanted to build, well, it doesn't even have the elements to build. If you wanted to grow plants, foods, etc., it doesn't even have the elements to make that possible. Medina was very different. Well, so was Ta'if. Medina was considered fertile land. The climate was even different. The climate was so different that the Sahaba, when they moved to Medina, they all got sick. When they migrated to Medina, they all got sick. They all got the flu. They're not used to this. They were used to a very hot climate in Mecca, dry, hot climate, but Medina was cool weather. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, because they all got sick, they all got the flu, they all got the humma, they all got fevers, they all got sick, and they were all just complaining that, oh my God, we didn't expect to get sick like this. That's when the Prophet ﷺ made dua for Taibah. So just keep that one in mind. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, when he moved to Medina, certainly Medina was not dependent on commerce, but it was more dependent on agriculture, farming. He's not used to farming. In fact, even the Prophet ﷺ, when he had seen the people in Medina baying on the trees, he forbid them from doing so. Then the following year, they didn't get any good harvest. So they asked the Prophet ﷺ, well, you told us not to bang on the palm trees, and now the palm trees didn't pollinate, and now we didn't get enough harvest. So that was the Prophet ﷺ. He wasn't introduced. He didn't really know much about farming. So he told them, Antum a'lam bi umuri dunyakum. You know more about your matters of dunya, because he's not familiar with it. He's not familiar with farming. He's not familiar with how palm trees pollinate and what they do in order to do that and all of that. He just thought that they were just banging on the trees for cultural reasons and not necessarily for farming reasons. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, when he moved to Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ had created a system to bring about the relationship between the Sahaba, between a person from Medina and person from Mecca, because now you're talking about massive migration, or at least a large number of Muslims that migrated from Mecca to Medina. So that was going to create somewhat of pressure within the society of Medina. We're talking about housing, we're talking about employment, we're talking about food, we're talking about a number of different things that was basically necessary in order to make sure that these people are capable of surviving in a new environment. So that's why you had housing stay was made possible in the masjid, but still that wasn't good enough for families. And that was temporary. But you had others like Abdurrahman ibn Auf that, yes, certainly he stayed in this temporary housing, but then, and there was another temporary housing, which is Kulthum ibn al-Hadm. He was offering his own home for housing. And of course, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari as well. So you had some people that were offering housing, temporary housing, but still, you're talking about a number of different things to help these new immigrants. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, subhanAllah, some people are just skilled. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, when he moved and migrated to Medina, he was really trying to figure out the place. So he tells that Sahabi, he said, just show me off the market. He goes around the market, and then by looking at the market, he figured out how he can do business in order to get himself back into, I guess, having the money and not dependent on others. See, some people are just skilled. They just know wherever they may be, they just know how to figure themselves out, know what to do, and basically figure out a way not to depend on others, whether we're speaking about housing, whether we're speaking about food, income, etc. Some people just know how to do it. And subhanAllah, it's a skill. So of course you saw that some Sahaba, they were considered on the richer end. Other Sahaba were on the poor end. Hey, people have different capacities of how they know how to do it. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a Razzaq, but some people are good at sa'i. Some people are good at, I guess, figuring themselves out to know where to go and how to do this. So let's say these Sahaba, of course, we had mentioned this hadith, ذهب أهل الدثور بالأجور. The ones that had the treasures, they went, of course, these Sahaba that were on the poorer end, they went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, well, the richer Sahaba, they are going to be getting the most and the most reward and the highest reward, simply because look, they would pray like we would pray, they would fast like we would fast, and they have something that we don't have. يتصدقون بفضول أموالهم. They would be capable of giving donations what is beyond their, let's say, their needs, and what is beyond their necessary coverage, because they had the money. They have the money to donate extra. We're barely making our own expenses. We're basically just struggling with our food and struggling with our simple shelter, struggling with our just basics. But they have the money and they're going to be able to donate, and therefore they would get all the reward. In other words, they were thinking that that means this is a provision that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is controlling and not us controlling. Then how come that the rich are even getting a privilege, not only in dunya, but even in akhirah? That's how they saw it. They were basically speaking about it in that language. Like, wait a minute, how come these people are getting the privilege in dunya and akhirah? And here they are, they're even getting a bigger Jannah. So the Prophet ﷺ then answered, أَوَلَيْسَ قَدْ جَعَلَ لَكُم مَا تَصَدَّقُونَ إِنَّ بِكُلِّ تَسْبِيحَةٍ صَدَقَةٍ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't give you anything to basically donate and or even expand your privilege, that is. Well, what privilege do we have? Well, that's the privilege where the Prophet ﷺ is telling them, you've got a privilege to do the tasbih. You've got the privilege to do the takbir, which is Allahu Akbar. To do the tasbih means Subhanallah. To do the takbir, which is Allahu Akbar. To do the tahmid, which is Alhamdulillah. To do the tahleel, which is La ilaha illallah. To do the ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. Or even, and then he went, وَفِي بُضْعِ أَحَدِكُمْ صَدَقَةً. Even if you were to be intimate with your wife, the Prophet ﷺ telling the man, your wife could be wanting intimacy, but you probably don't feel like it. But at the end of the day, even if you were to be intimate with your wife, you would also get the reward for it. Now, that's what brought the other question. Would we be investing or somehow engaging in a lustful action and we would still get rewarded for it? How is that possible? They assume that only things that are challenging or something that requires an effort is the only thing that you would get reward for. And that's why they said that, hey, it would be really our own lust. It's not challenging. And that's extremely important to keep in mind, that not every good deed is only supposed to be in a pathway of something hard. Some good deeds, it can be in something that you would enjoy as well. So we would just have to figure things out. And here the Prophet ﷺ said, أَرَأَيْتُمْ لَوْ وَضَعَهَا فِي حَرَامٍ أَكَانَ عَلَيْهِ فِيهَا وِزْرٌ. Do you see, and here's the Prophet ﷺ bringing in that analogy, do you see if this person would have perhaps put it in somewhere that is not lawful onto him, would he be considered as committing a sin? If this intimacy happened with someone that is not a halal person to engage with, would there be a sin on that person? What would the ruling be? And that's where the Prophet ﷺ said right there, helping them see the analogy. And he said, فَكَذَلِكَ إِذَا وَضَعَهَا فِي الْحَلَالِ. That's the same way. If you were to put it in halal, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give him the reward for that. Now, that's when, of course, we went farther in the hadith. We talked about the hadith in regards to the different people that would be coming, or at least getting the punishment in hellfire. So we went with that, over with that hadith. We also talked about hadith Abu Kamsha al-Anmari. We went in details with that hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, ثلاثة أقسم عليهن. There are three that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala أقسم عليهن. It's like he's making an oath. وأحدثكم حديثا فاحفظوه. And I would tell you a hadith, so just memorize that. ما نقص مال عبد من صدقة. There's no wealth that is contributed for donation and it would become less. So in other words, the Prophet ﷺ was telling you that the value that you would be getting is coming in from a different area. So it's not that the actual number is staying the same. The actual number is definitely getting less when you are donating. But this is talking about the value of what you had received in return to the amount that you had donated. وَلَا ظُلِمَ عَبْدٌ مَظْلَمَ فَصَبَرَ عَلَيْهَا إِلَّا زَادَهُ اللَّهُ عِزًّا. I want to look at this one where the Prophet ﷺ was redefining the way people would usually define things. What does that mean? You would really usually within, of course, our times, everybody's talking about trauma. And right now, everybody seems to be traumatized somehow. They're traumatized from their mothers, they're traumatized from their fathers, they're traumatized from their siblings, they're traumatized from a teacher. And it could be over something like, well, my mom was constantly asking me to wash the dishes. My mom was constantly asking me to clean my room. My mom was, and then of course she's going to come forward and tell you that she was traumatized from her parents, even though her parents were just trying to probably put her on track with the different chores that were necessary to make her a successful person. But to her, it was traumatizing to just give her that challenge to do a chore. That's considered traumatizing. And believe it or not, especially during our times of the mental health and all of that, every person is coming forward complaining that their mother or their father was some form of a what is the word that is right now heavily used, and what is it, that they're narcissists, right? Everybody is talking about that there was someone narcissist in their family, and this could be their father, this could be their mother, and therefore they're the victims. So the second that they want to accuse somebody, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't any narcissists, there definitely are some narcissists out there, but there's no way that every single person is basically having this narcissist person. Everyone is having a narcissist person in their life, and they're being victims, they're being traumatized, and everybody is all of this. It's not that way. It is part of it that we're living in a society where everyone feels entitled, and this entitlement makes people think that they are victims and that they're supposed to be getting everything without needing the effort to invest in it. And therefore, whoever is sitting in a position of probably authority, or probably saying, here's what you got to do, here's what you need to do, etc., then that person is actually perceived as a narcissist that's somehow feeding their ego. And unfortunately, right now, it's becoming an easy thing where you could go on social media and start to actually look at certain descriptions, and everybody all of a sudden is a therapist. All of a sudden, everyone is specialized in analyzing people's personalities and knowing how to diagnose people. So here the Prophet ﷺ was telling you, well, no. وَلَا ظُلِمَ عَبْدٌ مَظْلَمًا. You would usually say, if you were a victim of some form of abuse, some form of dhulm, some form of oppression, you would think of it as this person lost their honor. This person is having no option but to harvest the abuse, the hardship that they had lived through, and therefore they would constantly be living, I would say, imprisoned with whatever trauma that they went through. But the Prophet ﷺ was teaching them that no, you're not supposed to be looking at the trauma, the abuse, the oppression that you went through, that it depleted you from your honor. Don't look at it this way. The Prophet ﷺ was telling you it didn't deplete you from your honor, and therefore you need to rethink how you define the world around you and how you define yourself. You need to recognize that just when you would think that someone is capable of removing your honor by abusing you, that you actually have it wrong, that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that gives izzah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that determines who is to be honored. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that determines where value is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that determines what distribution looks like and what the definitions that surround us are looking like, and what is defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically dependent on the truth of the matter, the truth of the different things that you may not have data in regards to. Just keep that in mind. There's certain data that you are missing out on, which is key to understanding how this world functions. You only have one side of the data, that perhaps this person was abused. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran was telling you, look at this one, pay attention to this one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. Whoever was killed in an oppressive manner, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give his guardians authority. Therefore, do not abuse it. With the same analogy, if we're looking at a person that was killed in an abusive manner, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never let abuse, oppression prevail. There's no way. There is no way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow it to have superiority, the upper hand. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that there are certain things that play out differently. In other words, never think that the abuse, the oppression that you went through, even if you were killed, don't think of it that it's going to be something that is defining your fate. Your fate is never defined by the person that abused you. You have to recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had played out another form of potential, another form of compensation, in where it would be in different forms. It could be in intelligence, it could be in wealth, it could be in different ways to compensate you for the oppression that you had underwent. Just keep that in mind. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that it will be in such large amounts, in such abundance, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. So do not abuse or engage in any form of qatl, because you will have the power and the ability to do it. So be careful. Make sure that you don't abuse that power and put it in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded that it was giving it justice. Just keep that one in mind. So the Prophet ﷺ said, وَلَا ظُلِمَ عَبْدٌ مَظْلَمَةً فَصَبَرَ عَلَيْهَا إِلَّا زَادَهُ اللَّهُ عِزًّا. Every single oppression or anybody that was abused, and they were patient about it. What is patient? Well, patient is to tell you that that was key. It's not enough to just go and just accept it somehow and say, well, this is what I went through. All right. But no, to be patient actually means you don't let that abuse that you went through, one, overcome you, two, consider Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being responsible for it. In other words, not being thankful and not understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to compensate you. So you would see many, of course, thinking that, well, why didn't Allah intervene? Why did Allah let this happen to me? That's kufr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that He is most just. You have to be patient. Don't whatsoever engage in haram things. So what does that mean? Because I underwent some form of abuse to perhaps find different means to perhaps find therapy in it. Maybe drinking, maybe drugs, maybe movies, maybe music, etc. All of this is not a sign of sabr. Sabr actually means you live the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You contain your emotions, whether it's an angry emotion, whether it's an emotion of pain, or whether it's an emotion of wanting, of course, to retaliate, or whether it's an emotion perhaps of feeling down, etc. You don't let it go too down. You don't let your anger go beyond the level of justice. You don't let your emotions of pain basically let you and feel despair in such a level that no, you would recognize, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is al-Jabbar, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives victory, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Razaq, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just. I recognize through those names and attributes that the Lord Almighty would never let injustice prevail, would never let me basically be within one fate, that is the fate of being a victim of abuse. You can choose to just live just constantly thinking that what defines you is abuse. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that's not what defines you. What defines you, إِلَّا زَادَهُ اللَّهُ عِزًّا. What defines you? You can choose. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, the Prophet is telling you, if you went through some form of abuse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you izz. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you some form of honor. He'll give you an honor, but you can choose to search for the honor, or you can choose to just constantly live imprisoned with your own trauma and feel that that's what defines you. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you no. But you have to work towards it. You have to work towards it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you He is going to compensate you. He did compensate you. Look for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. Continue working towards getting your izz. Don't look at al-mazlama. And it's this redirection of vision is what you could see in all the ahadith. That's the same thing right here. Redirecting your vision from looking at al-mazlama to looking at al-izz. From looking at the abuse to looking at honor, redirecting yourself from looking at pain to looking at treatment. That's why when you even make the dua, Allahumma rabban nas, adhib al-bas, washfi anta shafi, la shifa illa shifa'ak, ishfini shifa'an la ghadru saqama. What you would say in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ was teaching us to redirect your focus in this hadith. We said the word ishfini, shifa, and just the root shifa almost 6 to 7 times. Why? Because it was redirecting your focus. Don't just look at the pain, but I want you to focus on one word, which is a shifa. Same thing. Don't focus on abuse. I want you to focus on on honor. Don't focus that the money became less. I want you to focus that you gained a value. And this is redirecting our focus. Don't focus on failure, but focus on success. Don't focus on your poverty, but focus that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala بيده الرزق. الرزق is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're redirecting your focus. And that's how you're going to be capable of finding the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inspiring you to recognize that His power transcends every single corner. It goes beyond you, your power, your energy, your own work doesn't determine how data is played out in the world around you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power goes beyond your understanding of how things are played out. Your data is limited. Your data about yourself is limited. Your data about how things are played out within this life is limited. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was redirecting our focus, where the Prophet ﷺ, وَلَا فَتَحَ عَبْدٌ بَابَ مَسْأَلَةٍ إِلَّا فَتَحَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ بَابَ فَقْرٍ. Every single person that would open the door of a mas'ala, asking help from people, asking people to give them the contribution. They would think of it, once I got the promotion, once I got this money by asking people to give it to me, that somehow I basically got that value. I got what I wanted. Now I'm basically right there. I won something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, actually, the person that had searched and requested others' help, in other words, they weren't independent, but they were dependent on others. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open the doors of dependence / poverty. Because the second you start depending on others, that same minute you became enslaved and you became needing their service. The second that you need someone else's service to be done for you, that's when you had become dependent on them and you had become really needing them, and you yourself are not free. Once you don't recognize that, you had really lost a very important data about the circumstances that you're putting yourself into. And that's why he said, إِنَّمَا الدُّنْيَا لِأَرْبَعَةِ نَفَرٍ. Dunya is for 4 people, one that has the money and the knowledge. Why focus on the money and the knowledge? Why didn't he say money and health? Why money and knowledge? Well, he said money and knowledge because usually people see that as the privilege that brings in 1, honor, 2, of course, it gives them some form of authority. It's money. Well, money gives you a lot of privileges, and knowledge basically gives you social privilege. Of course, when a person might have a degree, people would perceive them as having a certain social status. Knowledge gives you a certain social status. It gives you, that social status gives you certain privileges, and the privileges might open up doors to money. Money opens up doors of authority without us realizing. It kind of goes like a snowball. Money gives you this, and then, of course, your life becomes easier. You basically start getting some form of an honor and some form of a privilege. But, well, let's see how this plays out. If a person had the money and had the knowledge, but then they invested that in 3 different areas. Let's see the first area they invested in, يَتَّقِي فِيهِ رَبَّهُ. يتقي فيه ربه means what? Well, they had Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be the center. And of course, this is a form of energy. This is a form of a privilege. This is a key. But they used this key or this tool in order to create a connection between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the center that determined how they used this privilege, this energy that they had. This is really, you just think of it. I used to love physics. Absolutely love physics. When you look at, and of course, science in general, you look at the nucleus, and the nucleus would have, of course, the main energy, and then the atoms or the electrons, well, the electrons would be rotating around in a certain way, but then the energy that's in the center is what determines the velocity, the speed that the electrons are going around in that orbit. And the number of atoms, the number of electrons is going to determine the identity, let's say it that way, what element that is or what compound that is. And of course, the way that they would unite with another electron from another perhaps element, that's what, and of course, the weight of that electron from one element to another really differs. So looking at that, it's really the same idea. You've got يتقي فيه ربه. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be their center. And then mal, wealth, and knowledge would act as these forces, these tools, these forces that would determine what and which direction and the speed and the energy that is basically used in order for you to orbit around within your community and to orbit around, of course, your life, etc., the span, all of it. And يصل فيه رحمة. That's a second, in where you've got number one, the nucleus. The first orbit is going to be your parents, is going to be your siblings, your family. And the third orbit, the second orbit, يعلم لله فيه حقا. And they would recognize that there are certain things that these provisions, or at least these privileges, were supposed to be invested in. So there's one investment for the sake of Allah. There's a second investment, which is for the sake of family. And then there's the third investment, يعلم لله فيه حقا. So what's the difference between يتقي فيه ربه and between يعلم لله فيه حقا? Well, they're all going for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يتقي فيه ربه is different because this money, they recognize that one, the income and how it's coming in, that it has to be based on the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And two, يتقي فيه ربه, in where, of course, they would consider the distribution. There are certain areas that the distribution is supposed to be distributed and invested in. And therefore, يتقي فيه ربه, perhaps you can use some of that wealth for maybe for entertainment. But what kind of entertainment are you spending your money on? Some entertainment is halal, some entertainment is haram. Some of it is a waste. Some of it is a contribution. What are you really spending on? We would usually think of money as, hey, I can use it the way I want. Well, not in Islam. Not in Islam. Such privileges are tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. And these tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you were areas that in itself actually contains the power to grant you Jannah. Yes. You would think of these tools as just things that you were really working on yourself, but you wouldn't think of it that no, you were given these tools for you to use in order to pave the way to your Jannah. Did you use them that way, or were you paving your way in this dunya? Let's continue. وَيَعْلَمُ لِلَّهِ فِيهِ حَقًّا. This, in this segment of it, يَتَّقِي فِيهِ رَبَّهِ, the principles of one, money management, making money, and of course, we're talking about income, how they're making that income, how they're spending it on themselves, or even on their family, etc. That's يَتَّقِي فِيهِ رَبَّهِ. يَعْلَمُ لِلَّهِ فِيهِ حَقًّا. No, it's deducting for zakah. There's a certain portion within your money that's supposed to be deducted to be allocated for zakah, allocated for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's يَعْلَمُ لِلَّهِ فِيهِ حَقًّا. In other words, يَتَّقِي فِيهِ رَبَّهِ is what you're spending on yourself and what income you're generating, and يَعْلَمُ لِلَّهِ فِيهِ حَقًّا, what you're deducting from the wealth to allocate it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَهَذَا بِأَفْضَلِ الْمَنَازِلِ. That's going to be the best of this, the best of the levels, the best of the stages, the best of those that would be using their wealth and their knowledge in order to invest it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's see. Number 2. عبد رزقه الله علما ولم يرزقه مالا. Another person, another servant, they had the knowledge, but they didn't have the money. But this person, صادق النية, they were really honest and sincere in their intention. And they said, if I had the money, I would have done like that person. If they were really honest with their intention. Let's say they said, if I had $1 million, I would have opened an orphanage and I would have bought an Islamic school and then they went on and they were really honest with it. You know, someone else might say, well, if I had $1 million, I'd buy a mansion, I'd buy this car, that car, etc. But if the person, they didn't have the money, but they just said, I would have invested it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what I would have done. So in that situation, the person, based on the intention, even though nothing was technically invested, just by having the intention, فَهُوَ بِنِيَّتِهِ, just by having the intention, it is as if you had really donated $1 million, just by the intention. Yes, just by the intention. It's like you had just donated $1 million right there, even though you probably struggling to pay your bills. But ya Allah, this is so beautiful. You know, you could just sit there and just daydream. If you had $1 million, what would you really do with it? We would usually just sit down and just think of, what would I do with $1 million? And we would just sit down and just think of it as, hey, we're just here, just, lavishly talking. And even though this is impossible for me to get $1 million, but you're right there. I mean, of course, I'm just saying $1 million, but it's not like it's the biggest number. $1 million right now during our times is really nothing. It's not much, at least, not nothing, but it's not much. All right. When you could be just sitting down and not necessarily taking much of your talk seriously, but you could be sitting right there at that moment and you and your friends talking about what you would do with $1 million or more. And if you really had an honest niyyah, as if you had invested $1 million or more, just sitting on the couch and not even having probably even $50,000 in your bank account, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is considering that you had just donated $1 million on the spot. Just imagine that. All right. فَأَجْرُهُمَا سَوَاء. Said, and their reward is basically the same. A person that had the money but didn't really have it, and a person that had the money and donated, and a person that didn't have the money but had the intention. وعبدا رزقه الله مالا ولم يرزقه علما. Another servant, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him the wealth but didn't give him the knowledge. But this person was using his wealth with no knowledge, and of course not necessarily having the taqwa. They're probably just spending it on haram things, weren't even spending it on family and relatives, and not even engaging in them, considered them, though this is their responsibility. And they wouldn't necessarily apply things based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلَا يَعْلَمُ لِلَّهِ فِيهَا حَقًّا, and would not necessarily spend for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, not zakah, none of that. And فَهَذَا بِأَخْبَثِ الْمَنَازِلِ, this person at the lowest is at the lowest and worst rank. وَعَبْدٌ لَمْ يَرْزُقْهُ مَالًا وَلَا عِلْمًا, and a person that was not given not wealth and not knowledge, but in other words, they didn't really have any privilege. Right there, they didn't see that they had the intelligence, I guess, to study, so they didn't really study. They didn't have the money. They tried to work, but I guess every single business that they would try to do, it would just go into failure. Then in that situation, he was saying, if I had the money, I would have done like that person. And if I had the knowledge, I would have done like this person and given da'wah and all of that. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَهُوَ بِنِيَّتِهِ فَوَزْرُهُمَا سَوَاء. If he were to, I guess, hope to spend it in haram, then they would just right there get bad deeds, and they didn't really do anything. They were just contemplating. They were just wishfully thinking to do something haram or to do something halal. If they were wishfully thinking to do something haram, then in that situation, they just got bad deeds when they were just really not even doing it. They thought, if I had $1 million, I would have bought a liquor store or whatever. Then in that situation, you didn't even buy the liquor store, but just by saying that, it is as if you had just bought a liquor store. And this is extremely scary because during our times, it's cheap to say any words. And people would not take much of it. It's like not a big deal. They're just saying anything, not even taking their words seriously and thinking of it as, well, I'm just saying, come on, I'm just, hey, we're just talking here. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَلْفِظُ مِنْ قَوْلٍ إِلَّا لَدَيْهِ رَقِيبٌ عَتِيدٌ. For every single word, for every single sentence that you, in every single word that you would utter. There's an angel. Raqibun Atid. He would be watching each and every single word and what you were saying. And Atid, the second that you would say it, he'd be right there ready to note it down. So you really got to be careful. Let's see. Right there, the Prophet ﷺ, and this is فيما يرويه عن ربه عز وجل. What does that really mean? Let's see in English. Indeed, Allah has prescribed good deeds and bad deeds and has made them clear. Okay, so whoever intends to do a good deed but does not carry it out, Allah records it for him as a complete good deed. And if he intends it and does it, Allah records it for him as 10 good deeds, up to 700 times or even more. And whoever intends to do a bad deed but does not carry it out, Allah records it for him as a complete good deed. But if he intends it and does it, Allah records it for him as one bad deed. Let's look at Lugha Arabiya. So this is a Hadith Qudusi. عن ابن عباس. Who's Ibn Abbas? Ibn Abbas, his name is Abdullah ibn Abbas. Abdullah ibn Abbas, when the Prophet ﷺ died, he was only 13 years old. Well, approximately. Abdullah ibn Abbas is the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. Abdullah ibn Abbas is the one that the Prophet ﷺ had made the dua for him. Allahumma faqihhu fi din wa'allimhu at-ta'wil. Ya Allah, give him knowledge in the religion and knowledge in interpreting the religion. All right, what did he say? That the Prophet ﷺ had said, فِيمَا يَرْوِيهِ عَنْ رَبِّهِ. Now this is called Hadith Qudusi. I'm going to just line that right there. I'm going to put Hadith Qudusi. I'm going to put that down. And this is called Hadith Qudusi. What does that mean? What that means is that these are the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're not transmitted in the same way that the Quran was transmitted. So the Prophet ﷺ was saying it on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is the quote? إن الله كتب الحسنات والسيئات ثم بين ذلك فمن هم بحسنة فلم يعملها كتبه الله له عنده حسنة كاملة فإن هو هم بها فعملها كتبها الله له عنده 10 حسنات إلى 700 ضعف إلى أضعاف كثيرة ومن هم بسيئة فلم يعملها كتبه الله له عنده حسنة كاملة فإن هو هم بها فعملها كتبها الله له سيئة واحدة. If إن الله كتب الحسنات والسيئات, the Lord Almighty basically recorded or kept track of all the good deeds and the bad deeds, and then clarified that. So whoever does a good deed, but, or at least ham. What is ilham? Ilham can have several meanings. Ilham can mean to intend to do something, but the etymology of it actually means something else. Ilham could also be the calamity, the anxiety, what's keeping you occupied mentally, and you're not capable of thinking about anything else. That's ilham. But when a person, you look at here, فَمَنْ هَمَّ بِحَسَنَةٍ. In other words, what got them occupied was really wanting to do a certain hasana. They were so occupied because they had a lecture to prepare for, or they had a masjid event to set up, or they probably had some people to help. That's hamma. That's what was occupying their mind. That's what was occupying their time. That's what was constantly there as the issue that they were concerned about, which is il-hasana, the good deed that they want to do, perhaps to be there for that poor person, to support them, to maybe perhaps to look for different ways of finding perhaps a donation for that person to cover their expenses. If the person did not do that good deed, they just intended it. They just thought about it. They were occupying their mind with it. Then in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would write كَتَبَهَ اللَّهُ لَهُ عِنْدَهُ حَسَنَةً كَامِلَةً. It would be recorded as a complete good deed. If فَإِنْ هُوَ هَمَّ بِهَا فَعَمِلَهَا كتبه الله له عنده 10 حسنات إلى 700 ضعف إلى أضعاف كثيرة. If this person and what they had intended, they actually did it. In other words, they implemented it. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would write it for them as 10 deeds, and every single one of these deeds would be multiplied to equal 700. And of course, أضعاف كثيرة actually means it would be multiplied to even more numbers, and it would maybe exceed even 700. And whoever intends to do a bad deed, but they didn't do it, and there's a difference between didn't do it because they wanted to repent, or whether it's that they didn't do it. Perhaps they basically thought of robbing a bank. But then when it was time to rob the bank, the alarm rang and didn't want to get caught, so wanted to run away. So in that situation, did they actually do it? No, they didn't. But just by not doing it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically give them the reward for not doing it, but not if they had put in a certain attempt. If they put in a certain attempt, then they'll get punished for the amount of whatever they had attempted to do. If they were to do فإن هو هم بها فعملها كتبها الله له سيئة واحدة. If they had intended to do that harm and they did it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will only write it and record it as one deed. So it is 10:49 right now, at least my time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pause right here and leave some room for questions and answers, inshallah. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And I want you, even if there aren't any questions, we said we're going to leave this space for you to inspire us and tell us what inspired you in those hadith. Are we saying anything? Am I not hearing you, Sister Samira? I could see you unmuted yourself, but I don't hear you.
I don't have the sign for putting my hands up. I was looking for the reaction.
That's okay. That's okay. Go ahead, dear.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that reading this hadith and even all the other ones, what comes through is the rahmah and the love of Allah for His slaves, in how generous He is, how Kareem He is. He's Rauf, He's Kareem, He's Rahman and Rahim in wanting to give us so much for doing nothing, just for having our thoughts in the right place, even.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Exactly. Even if you just had your thoughts in the right place, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward you. And I guess, it also takes us within the same idea that just fix your thought. Just put your thinking in the right place, and you will see healing coming in. You will see success coming in. You will see how everything is going to be changing, not only in your dunya, but even in your akhirah. You just have to work first. If you want the miracles to happen around you, well, you have to work. And we're not here talking about actual miracles, but we're talking about the change in everything. You just have to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the power that is right there working in its course, in its force, to really change everything. But you really have to connect to the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to see how this is all played out, and not necessarily think of you as the one that does all the work. And it's not about believing in yourself, it's about believing in Allah Almighty. So Jazakallah khairan, Sister Samira. Did you want to add anything else, dear?
Just for the first class, you had asked about intentions, and at that time I didn't think about it as I wasn't able to say what I was thinking. But the importance, again, here also we are being rewarded for our intentions, and intentions are just so essential for our success in the akhirah. In the dunya, it doesn't matter. You may think you are doing something. For instance, a woman may take care of her husband, and she may be doing it in order to so that people can say, oh, she's so good with her husband. That will mean absolutely nothing in the hereafter. So the importance of intentions for our success in the hereafter, that we have to be very careful about our thoughts and our intentions. I think I'm just reiterating what we just said.
So yes, definitely, like you had said, when we're speaking about intentions, it's important that we would recognize that our intentions, they go beyond our situation. They have the energy, they have the force by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to change the situation and make the tradition become a religion. So it could be that you're, like you said, you're doing something for your husband, but why are you doing it? If you're going to be feeling that you're waiting for him or for other people to praise you, then you're going to get into this depression, anxiety when people are not giving you the praise that you want. That's why the Salihin used to say, al-ikhlas is istiwa'ul madhi with them. They said sincerity, and what defines sincerity is when praise and put downs to you are not going to change your action. So whether people praised you or whether people put you down, you recognize that it doesn't really matter to me. I'm doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anyways. And from that standpoint, I would like to say many times women would say, well, my kids are not appreciating me. My husband is not appreciating me, and they're not being appreciative. And I didn't even get a thank you, etc. Well, you're not getting it from the people. In fact, believe it or not, no one is really going to understand how much effort you had invested. Yes, men will never know what it means to be in a woman's body, trying to figure things out and trying to perhaps cook and clean. And probably you were having your period on that day, you're cramping, and you're probably having the tenderness and all that stuff. They're not going to understand what that means. They're totally not going to understand it. Or probably when you were staying up all night and trying to take care of the baby, trying to nurse the baby, and trying to every single 2 hours and all of that. And it's just your sleepless mind. You're not capable of focusing, all of that. No one's going to understand what you're going through. And no, the man and the men will never understand how hard it is to be a mom or how hard it is to be a wife and compromise. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا صَدَقَاتِكُم بِالْمَنِّ وَالْأَذَى. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't override or void the good deeds that you had invested in al-man and al-adha. What is al-man? Al-man is when you're constantly bragging. I had done this to you. Remember? I'm always cooking for you. I'm always cleaning for you. I'm always cleaning the bathrooms and cleaning everything for you. And what are you doing for me? You're not doing anything. That's bragging that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that all that work that you had been doing, it was just one word, and you had just collapsed all the investment that you had invested in. Or al-adha. Just because you contributed to someone, you think that you have the right to somehow enslave them or take their money away or whatever it is. And think that, yeah, well, I've done all of this, therefore I would have the right to take their money. I would have the right to somehow use all the necessary means because perhaps this person did harm you in certain ways. Maybe. But to think that you have the right to somehow take away their rights and in certain ways to retaliate because you wanted to be one, not only the victim, but even the judge. in what you would be the one to determine what makes a fair compensation? That's not fair. Why are you the one that's determining what makes a fair compensation? Why not a third party? And then, of course, al-adha, then you'll see, here it is, all that you were probably a victim indeed. But then you would see many, they would be contributing in good ways and it would look good, but then they would, even though they did contribute, but they would really override and remove all the good deeds that they had invested in. And what happens? Well, they just erased everything by harm. You just harmed the person that you contributed to. You just harmed the people that you were trying to support by telling them that, oh, why can't you do this? Or you're basically right there attacking them. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that part of in Surah Al-Duha, for a sa'il, la tanhar. For a person that's a beggar, don't go. Or a person that is asking for your help, la tanhar. Don't humiliate them just because you want to contribute in any way. You don't want to contribute, that's fine. You don't want to contribute, that's fine. But it doesn't mean that if you were to contribute, or if you didn't want to contribute, that you would somehow give yourself the justification to somehow humiliate others. Sa'il fala tanhar. You don't have the right to humiliate anybody. So what was that all for? Well, that was for whatever contribution you would contribute within your home, within your household. Make it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not for the sake of your husband or your in-laws to praise you. Make it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And don't stop when people don't praise you, because you're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's all that matters. So this is it, inshallah. I know we were supposed to be doing Asma Allah al-Husna, but I was asked yesterday not to do Asma Allah al-Husna right now because it was going to be too late on you. That's what I was told. So I thought of moving the date of Asma Allah al-Husna to making it, you see these 2 hours that we were doing, what's it called? Hadith in. I thought we could, instead of making even tafsir late, we would make all the classes earlier, just so that you guys would get in a good enough sleep and not necessarily get too late, and kind of help you get your hours in place, inshallah. Is that better?
Yes, definitely. It gets late here.
It gets late here.
Sheikha, I had another request. I don't know if the other people in the class would want it, and I don't know what your schedule is like, but is it possible to do this class on besides a Sunday night here?
Besides a Sunday night. Well, we already listed it at on a Sunday, and I believe it was a Friday.
Friday.
Yeah, Friday and a Sunday. But inshallah, we will be doing the other classes. So even if you don't join this one in person, or at least live, it will be recorded.
Recorded. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it will be recorded. And well, that gives you the privilege to speed up sometimes the recording, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But the other class, inshallah, we're going to be changing the timing for tafsir, and we're going to be changing the timing for Asma Allah al-Husna. There are only 3 classes left for Asma Allah al-Husna. So I was thinking of making it either Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, and it would be early. Well, it would be like, what is it, 8 a.m. your time? So 2 hours from now. Is that 8 a.m.? Am I right? Yeah, so it would be basically instead of this class, for example, on a Sunday, it would be on a Wednesday, but during the hours of these classes. So we started, think of it as 2 hours from now. All right. Right now it's 11. So we would be talking about 9 a.m. my time, and it would be 8 a.m. your time, 8 p.m. your time. All right. Hopefully maybe inshallah Thursday or Wednesday. We'll announce it inshallah. And I'll let you inshallah all rest. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik.